and welcome to this pyroseminar that is going to be looking at the area of politics and religion and philosophy and kind of the intersection between those. For this seminar, the description of it was pretty heavy. I was saying about how I want to look at Hegel, and I want to look at how Hegel's understanding of religion has something interesting to say to today, and actually something interesting to say in the political environment that we live in. And as soon as you mention people like Hegel, it sounds like it's going to be a very heavy session. But what I really want to do here is have a more informal introduction to the work of Hegel and what Todd McGowan has called the right-wing deviation within the left. Right, so that's really what I want to do. I want to look at this phrase, the right-wing deviation in the left, which is a way of trying to see if there is something within progressive and liberal politics today that is in danger of being destructive and creating kind of certain violence within society. What is that? How do we identify it, etc., etc.? So that's kind of the question, but it also relates to pyrotheology, as all of these seminars do in some sort of way, and it relates to the work of Hegel. So I'm going to paint a broad picture, and it's really, I guess, an introduction to what I'm going to be looking at in greater detail in a course that I'm doing in a few months called The Tyranny of Oneness. And that's a course where we're going to look at Todd McGowan's book, Emancipation After Hegel. It's not going to be a direct book study, but that's going to be the core text around which the course is going to revolve. So to start with, I want to create a kind of, like in philosophy and in all disciplines really, you start off and you make basic distinctions between things. And then, of course, the deeper you go, the more you realize that the distinctions, while they're useful to get you to orient yourself in a field, give way to more complicated understandings. But if we wanted to split the kind of underlying theory that lies behind conservative thinking and the underlying theory which lies behind what's traditionally would be called leftist theory, you could start by talking about the difference between the idea of the universe as an organic whole, an organism, or the universe as being propelled by a type of dialectic movement of antagonism. Right? So you've got these two positions. One is that the world is, broadly speaking, like the universe itself, the physical world, the chemical world, the world of animal, mineral, vegetable, right? These different worlds, these different kingdoms, or are analogous to an organism in which things work together. And from that perspective, problems within our world are seen as threats to this organic wholeness, this oneness. So of course within conservatism then you often have this look back to something in the past that was good. You know, the organism before some sort of threat, some sort of virus or cancer is introduced into the system. The world is a body. The political structure or society is a body. The individuals within society are the lifeblood of the organism. They are the cells that make up the organic whole. And then on the left, you tend to have theorists who talk about the idea that actually the world, the universe, is propelled by contradictions, deadlocks, and antagonisms. That the way society moves forward is not that it's an organic whole, but that there is what's called difference. Not the difference between two things, right? The difference between a house and an apartment, or the difference between two types of cars. There is this weird minimal difference of something with itself. And it's a very abstract idea, but you can think about it even in terms of how we are not at one with ourselves, right? So I have a friend I was talking to recently who was talking about an ex of his, and he was, trying to work out why she was being nice to him on one occasion and then not nice on another, and he couldn't kind of like understand, you know, what was she, did she like him, did she not like him, what was she thinking? And he was, like us all in those kinds of environments, was trying to figure out, what does the other want of me? Which, by the way, is a definition of anxiety for Lacan. For Lacan, anxiety always is connected with the question, what am I to the other, right? Who am I to the other? What do they think of me? So even in terms of a social anxiety, there is behind it this idea of, what does society want of me? Or you go to a party and you feel anxious because, like, what does the party want of me? Well, how should I be acting? It's not just that there's a certain, you know, anxiety is the fear of nothingness, but it's actually more connected with, you don't know your place in the world, right? So you don't know where you fit. And why am I saying that? Oh yeah. So, you know, where my friend is looking at his ex and going, what does she want of me, right? This anxiety is produced. And as we talked, and he kind of knows this, but I'm saying, well, the problem is, like, it's not that she has the secret and you have to figure it out, is that she doesn't know herself, right? She doesn't know whether she likes you or dislikes you. You know, she's got a complex of emotions, and what we tend to do is we tend to fantasize that the other person is a singular self with a singular view, and we're trying to figure out what it is. What is that singular view? Who am I to them? When the more difficult truth is that the other person, just like ourselves, is a mystery and is a bundle of contradictions. And this is what Hegel meant whenever he said the mysteries of the Egyptians are mysteries to the Egyptians as well. Because what he's kind of saying is, we look at the Egyptians and we look at their what do you call them? Hieroglyphs? Yeah, hieroglyphs. And we don't know what they mean, and we don't know what the religion of the Egyptians meant. And Hegel's just making a funny point where he says, you know, you get back to them and you talk to the ancient Egyptians. They will potentially say, we don't know what it means either, right? We are a mystery to ourselves. We are trying to understand our place in the universe. And it's just a clever way of Hegel saying, you're always thinking the other is a substantive whole. The other's just as divided as you are. And so you take that and then just kind of apply it universally. That within the left there is more of this notion. That's why the leftist tends to look forward, right? Not back. Because what happens is, the progression of history is the progression of deadlocks and contradictions in a given historical moment. And the resolution of those contradictions leads to higher contradictions and different contradictions. And that's how we move forward. So on one side, you've got this notion of an organic whole. On the other side, you've got this notion of a dialectic rupture that is moving. And we're going to come back to the origins of those ideas in a minute, or at least the dialectic in a minute. But to see an extreme version of this, you can turn to an extreme figure of the right, which is Hitler, and an extreme version of a figure of the left, Stalin. Right? You've got these two figures, and in no way do I think the politics can be reduced to these types of extremes. Right? This is often what happens, is people get thrown in with Hitler or a Stalin or whatever. But it's useful to see extreme things in order to see the less extreme versions, and even less extreme is maybe not fair quite, but to see what is shared in some way. So with Hitler in Mein Kampf, and I was actually looking at Mein Kampf recently to kind of explore this again, is you'll see that Hitler is constantly, or not constantly, but it's very, right throughout Mein Kampf, is talking about society as an organic whole and the political system as, an attempt to protect the organism, to keep it in its life cycle. And individuals are the cells of the organism, or they're the lifeblood of the organism. So you've got this very organic type of exploration. And then there is the figure of the Jew, the Jewish community. And they are described as a disease, a tumor, cancerous, right? A poison, something that's being injected into the organism that threatens to poison it, that threatens to disintegrate it, that threatens to destroy it. So what you have here is you have the organic whole, and then, because you have to explain social antagonisms, you have this Jewish community. They are the threat that is coming in to disrupt this organic unity that humans should be with themselves, each other, with the world, within their environment, right? And so you've got that on one extreme. And then with Stalin, he is a dialectical materialist. So Stalin writes about the dialectic, the movement of history, of contradiction, and this contradiction leading finally through to communism, right? So there's the kind of the two versions. But, and here's where I want to kind of provisionally define what I mean by, and what I think Todd McGowan means by, the right-wing deviation within the left. Because if you look at someone like Stalin, you see that the dialectic contradiction, the deadlocks that move society forward, ultimately culminate in a type of utopia, which is called communism, right? We find the resolution of the conflicts, the resolution of the contradictions. So there's a teleological element to it. Even though there's no like divine teleology, there's a teleology of history, of fate. History is pushing in a direction, getting to the point at which we overcome all the contradictions of capitalism and of the contradictions of other modes of production, other eras before capitalism, and we get to the place of communism. And that is potentially can be called the right-wing deviation within the left, is that the dialectic is seen not as some sort of eternal reality, but is seen as a provisional path to some sort of future whole. So in other words, while conservatives will tend to look back at an organic whole, this form of the left, they look forward to a type of organic whole that we will get to, like a kind of Teilhard de Chardin's kind of like a mega point, right? This future point that we will get to. And Todd McGowan, in his book, The Emancipation After Hegel, and Slavoj Žižek's work, his most recent book, which is another good one, called Sex in the Field Absolute, is also an exploration of this, is the idea that actually we've lost something, and it's something important, that actually a lot of the violence that you see within the left and historically in the 20th century has been precisely because there is this notion that we can get to a non-antagonistic organic society. And what happens then is contradiction is reduced to opposition. So this is key, right? Contradiction in Hegel, who we're going to come to in a minute, is the idea that at the very heart of reality there is a deadlock, and it is that deadlock that fuels the forward movement of being into life, into consciousness, into self-consciousness. And you know, this is before Hegel's writing, before the big insights in biology and in physics and in mathematics and other fields that seem to kind of come to similar conclusions to this. But he is saying that there is, but in biology is a good example with Darwin. He's discovering that the complexity of biological creatures in their environment is connected to this antagonism and conflict called evolution, right? Natural selection, etc., etc. So that's contradiction. Now then, what we all tend to do, I think this is a tendency within human being psychology, is we want to reduce contradiction to opposition. And what opposition means is when you encounter the difficulties within your life, what you want to do is you want to find an enemy. You want to find something that you can blame for that contradiction, for that difficulty, and then you want to cut it out like a cancer, right? Which is kind of like the ground zero of fascism, right? It's that there's an organic whole, there's a disruption to the organic whole, you need to get rid of that disrupting figure, right? That disease, and then you can return to kind of oneness. And it's such a natural part of our thinking that on a psychological level, you go to a therapist, often because something is disrupting your life. And you think it's something external, that there was a breakup that happened, or there's a relationship that you're in, or there's work problems, or whatever life problems you have. There's something that is disrupting your existence, that is causing you suffering, that is creating symptoms in your life. And a symptom, as I've talked about before, can be thought of as a contradiction that is consolidated in a place. So, an example is where you grind your teeth, and maybe you grind your teeth at night because there's something you need to say to somebody, but you don't want to say it. So you're kind of, the symptom is the grinding of the teeth. You want to say something, but you also don't want to say it, and it solidifies or condenses into a symptom. And you go to a therapist, a good psychoanalyst, and you're tend to be there to go like, can you bring the wholeness back to my life? I want to get rid of this disruption? What do I do? Do I break up with this person? Do I stay with this person? Do I try to find a new job? Whatever it is. And what happens within proper psychoanalysis is that you find that these contradictions that are within your life, you can start to resolve them, but they lead to deeper contradictions, and then eventually the cure is when you realize that at a very fundamental level, contradiction is what makes you who you are. That's what gives birth to subjectivity. That's what drives us. That's what moves us. It is the beginning, the middle, and the end. And we reconcile ourselves to that contradiction in some way. And in reconciling ourselves to that contradiction, a lot of the negative dimensions of it begin to fall away. So just within a typical neurotic kind of patient, that kind of stuff would be happening. So we think that the idea is to get rid of the contradiction, but really we start to deepen it. We find it, we come to terms with it. But our desire is to reduce contradiction to opposition, right? To find some way of blaming some other for the problem and not seeing that the problems are inherent and systemic and actually potentially the very nature of reality itself. So that's contradiction and opposition. So within conservatism, you can see that opposition is very much at work. But within this kind of right-wing deviation of the left, again, contradiction can be reduced to opposition. And I wonder if I want to, I'll say a little bit more about that in terms of today's politics. So not thinking about Stalinism or anything like that, but thinking about progressivism as an example, is that often what you seem to find is that there is not a problem with the economic system as such. There are bad actors within the economic system. So we are trying to isolate the bad people on Wall Street, the sexist CEOs, the racist managers, the transphobic companies, right? And if we can only get rid of the bad actors, the system would run better for everybody, right? So at the moment, only some people can come to the table, but we want everybody to be able to come to the table, rather than maybe overturning the table. We'll come to that, right? So some people come to the table, everyone come to the table. The problem is not there's no inherent contradiction to the system. The system isn't working because of opposition, because there is some bad actors. And depending on where your political position is, those bad actors will be the Democrats, the Republicans, there'll be certain hedge fund people, there'll be certain pharmaceutical companies or whatever. That is the reduction of contradiction to opposition, with the fantasy that if we only got rid of the opposition, then we would be left with a smooth running organic society. And I want to kind of unpick why potentially that's a fantasy that doesn't work. That actually the very thing that we think we'd be left with when we get rid of all the bad actors, and of course there are bad actors in the world, right? In every society, every system, every political position, you will have bad actors, right? But the issue is the fantasy that if only we got rid of these bad actors, these people who are opposing the system, we will be left with a well-running system, covers over the fantasy that perhaps actually we need opposition in order to keep that fantasy alive. If we got rid of the bad actors, what we'd find is not a really pure system, but a system that is inherently corrupt. Not corrupt for contingent reasons, as in contingent reasons because of these people, X, Y, and Z, but a system that is necessarily corrupted, that there's something about it that creates alienation even when it's running perfectly, even when it's running well. So let me see, where am I at? Oh yeah, we end up often today then, and you see this with corporations. So corporations love social justice stuff, like Gillette recently did it, but in Pride Month there recently, you see all of these shops that put up the Pride flag and all of that, because in a sense, then that's politics. And for a lot of people, is that if we are nice to people and if we get rid of racism and sexism, sectarianism, then the system works. That's the type of fantasy. And you see this fantasy, of course, again at an extreme, and I'm only using fascism because it's such an easy way to see the structure, right? In fascism, the fascist thinks that if they got rid of the Jewish community, they would be left with an organic system that runs well. Rather, it's actually the shared enemy that keeps the system together. As long as you've got the shared enemy, you don't have to look at the inherent contradictions, right? Because you're putting them onto somebody else. Scapegoating mechanism. You take the inherent contradictions within the structure, you put it onto a contingent actor, and then you imagine that if you got rid of that contingent actor, you would get rid of the contradictions. Hypochondria. A hypochondriac is the same kind of thing, right? If you're hypochondria, if you've got hypochondria, you believe that you have an illness that you don't necessarily have, right? You may actually have it, but hypochondria is not about that. It's about you psychologically needing the illness, right? So if you think you've got cancer, what's happening is there's potentially certain traumas in your life, right, that are inherent to your history, your past, and yourself. But what you're able to do is get those traumas and put it onto something. So you go, the reason why I feel so worried and uptight and scared is because I'm worried that I've got this disease, because I think I've got this disease. And so the disease is the enemy, but you love your enemy, like there's two ways to love your enemy, right? You can love your enemy like a hypochondriac loves their disease. And that's a bad way of loving your enemy, which means you need it. You hate it, but actually it's what holds you together. And if you got rid of it, you'd have to face something even worse, which is the traumas that are actually within you. So you can put the trauma on the cancer or on the mice or on spiders or whatever it is, right? The phobic object. And that's a way of maintaining some distance from something that is within you. So this structure of putting onto a contingent other the inherent contradictions within the system is something that you see a lot today. And politics is reduced then to not the problem with the system, but a problem with bad actors within the system. And right, so let's now take a step back. I want to take a moment and do some basic kind of Marxism, right? And then we're going to look at Hegel and Feuerbach. So what I want to do is I want to take Marx's theory here and just outline his position. Because interestingly, Marx is trying to argue that even within our contemporary society, even if it was running perfectly, it would still create inherent alienation and economic crises, etc. Right? So I want to look at why he thinks that. We're going to cover it pretty quick. And so, okay, how do we do that? Right. For Marx, and interestingly, like Marxism is interesting. Like in America, people don't really study Marxism. I think it's because of the history of the Cold War and all of that kind of thing. But people don't know that Marx was first and foremost a philosopher, and a philosopher of political economy. And his critique of capitalism is not inherently moral. It's not very vicious. In fact, he's got a lot of time for capitalism. He thinks capitalism resolves a lot of contradictions that are within previous epochs. But he just doesn't think it's the end of history, right? So what he tries to do in Capital is he tries to understand what capitalism is, like deeply understand it. Not critique it, not whatever, just deeply understand where it came from, what are its deadlocks, and what then will it potentially, will it internally collapse, what will come afterwards, right? So Marx has like basically 7 different, what he calls modes of production. And a mode of production is basically the way that a society organizes itself and produces products and distributes those products, right? So for Marx, there's 2 things that very much distinguish us as human beings. One is we do labor, and 2 are social relations. So to be human is to labor. You know, we've got that in the very beginning of the Bible, the curse, where we're cursed to work the land, right? So labor of various kinds. If we don't labor, we'll die, right? So labor, and also how we relate to other people. And they're intertwined for Marx, because whenever you produce, whether you produce with other people, you produce for yourself and your family, you want to sell that product or barter that product with other people, you have to work alongside other people, right? Negotiate with other people. So there's something inherent about the social relations. We inherently have to build, we have to labor, we have to mold the world, and with agriculture, with technology, and we have to relate to each other. And so modes of production are just the kind of the way that an epoch does that. The way an epoch organizes its social relations and organizes its labor and productive powers. And you start off basically hunter-gatherer tribes, right? So that's the very first one, right? You've got a mode of production, hunter-gatherers, you go out, you hunt animals. There's, the men go out and do that, the women are giving birth to children, and all of the bits and pieces. Men are more disposable, so they go out to kill and be killed. And in the village, women bringing up the kids and kind of propagate the community, right? And all of the things that go around a hunter-gatherer society, right? So you've got that very early mode of production. Then you've got, Marx talks about what's called the Asiatic mode of production. I won't go into detail about that, it's a little bit strange, but he says that there is it's not quite slavery, but there was slavery involved and coercive work to build the pyramids and all this kind of stuff. But there's this Asiatic mode of production he talks about. Then we get into the ones that we're more familiar with. Then there's slavery. There's feudalism. Then capitalism, right? So there's the 5: hunter-gatherer, Asiatic, slave mode of production, I just said it, feudal, capitalist, right? Those are the 5. And then the 2 potential future ones, socialist, communist, right? Socialism is potentially the one that arises after capitalism, and then communism arises out of socialism. And Marx doesn't write very much at all about socialism or communism. Like out of everything he wrote, there's like a dozen pages or something like that, because the idea is, within Marxist theory, the modes of production arise out of our concrete needs and our technological achievements. So any given society, it uses what it has in order to produce what it needs. And what happens is, over time, that mode of production develops. Maybe it develops new technologies, new ways of doing things, and eventually it creates problems that it can't resolve within its existing frame. And it evolves for a while, and it makes quantitative changes for a while, but eventually it creates problems and crises and deadlocks that it cannot solve within its own terms. And then it kind of gives way to a new mode of production. So each movement in history doesn't come about by people thinking about what the next thing's going to look like, right? That's called an idealist view, right? The idealist view is that history progresses because of the ideas of people. People sit around, they conceptualize new forms of life and move into it. This is a materialist reading, and a materialist reading is saying, no, it might look like that, but the ideas that are generated come out of concrete problems that exist within the current mode of production. And each mode of production carries with it the remnants or the fossils of the earlier modes of production, and the seeds of what will come next. especially near the end, right? Near the end of an epoch of a mode of production, then you'll really start seeing the seeds, because you'll start to see the cracks. You'll start to see what it cannot solve within its own terms, and you'll begin to see the solutions starting to develop. So for Marx, he called socialism the next move after capitalism. He wrote a bit about that. And then really you could say communism is this last stage. And I think there's almost only one line about communism, which is from each according to ability to each according to need. Right, so that's basically all that's said about it. It's because we can't really say, like for Marx and for Marxists in general, you can't really say too much about what the next epoch's going to be, because what you'll end up just doing is basically creating a utopia, a vision of the future that is just a cleaned up version of what you presently have, because that's the horizon out of which you see everything. So instead of kind of trying to theorize what it looks like next, what you've got to do is show the contradictions in the present system, and then you can maybe begin to lean into what comes next. So I'm going to take slavery, feudalism and capitalism and show how the contradiction is working, just to give you a sense of how Marx's works. So you could say slavery, right, has a very, very obvious antagonism within it, master-slave, right? There's an obvious social antagonism in which some people are forced to work for others, and they are forced to work through might. Right, the sheer fact that if you do not work, you will be killed, you'll be punished or killed. And that's a very basic form of a mode of production. And it causes all sorts of problems. So in a nutshell, we just say, right, that's going to cause revolutions, rebellions, conflicts. It's not sustainable. And you'll need more slaves in order to do more work, and then they will gather and they'll fight against the masters, and then you reinstigate another master-slave dialectic, right? You've got this conflict. So what happens is the obvious injustice and the obvious oppression of slavery enters eventually into feudalism. And feudalism, you still have all of these oppressions and inequalities, but they're slightly different. So now the inequalities are primarily ideologically held. So in the slave culture, mostly you had to do what you were told or you'd be killed. In a feudalistic society, there was a whole religious system of why you are a vassal or why you're a lord, why you have to obey the king, right? Why you're a peasant, right? There's a whole ideological system that you're taught in the church and in schools or in the house and the family that try to solidify the injustice and show that it's not really an injustice, right? But it's there, and there's a certain injustice. But also within feudalism, you do have the beginnings of a market, right? So maybe in feudalism, you have to give 10% of your product to your lord, right? For basically no reason, and you have to give some to the church, right? Or you're going to get killed, right? It's just the way it is. But the other stuff that you produce, you go into the marketplace and you barter, right? And over time, what happens, of course, is it starts off where you're bartering. I have a cow and you have 10 chickens. We go, okay, right, yeah, 10 chickens for a cow, that's fine. Or no, I want 20 chickens for a cow. You're going in and you're bartering. And of course, eventually what happens is you might not want 20 chickens, right? But you want a sheep. And so what you do is, you know someone else who wants 20 chickens. So you give your cow to the person with the chickens, they give the chickens to you, and then you give the chickens to the other person and they give you the sheep, right? And you get what you want more indirectly. And this is the beginning of where something stands in for value. So you're not directly bartering, now you're bartering between people. This eventually leads to the need to have some sort of universal value, which is money, which can stand in. So I can just get money for my cow, and then at a later date I can use that to get other things. So we have the beginnings of a market system. Now here's the interesting thing, right? Feudalism then gives way to capitalism, right? The contemporary mode of production. What is capitalism? It's really interesting. Like, what is capitalism? We all use the word, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, but like, what is it in its core, in its essence? And a number of things you could say about that, but we'll try and define it. is capitalism is a market economy, and here's the advantage over feudalism. Is in feudalism, there's still all of this inequality. Some people are above the law. Some people can do whatever they want. Some people are mistreated. Within capitalism, everybody is under the law. Everybody is treated as an equal subject. Now then, first thing that comes back, of course, is that's not true, right? There's always exceptions. But you've got to understand that whenever Marx is analysing this, he's analysing it as a social scientist. So he always takes the system as the best form, as its ideal. Just think about Newton's laws of motion, right? We say that an object remains at the same speed unless a force acts upon it, right? Now, we don't ever see that in reality. That's not something that happens in reality. That's an ideal that is mathematically and logically true, but that we don't see in nature. But we have the ideal, and that's what science does. It finds the universal. So when Marx is looking at something like feudalism or capitalism, he's not looking at it in its impurities. He's looking at it in its ideals, right? And in its ideal, everybody is under the law. Everyone is equal. Some people are rich and poor, but no one's above the law. We enter the marketplace as equals, not with the same amount of stuff, but we're all equals in the marketplace. And I bring whatever I have into the marketplace, this painting or this speaker here, I bring that into the marketplace, and I always get what it's worth. So that's key about markets, is that kind of in a sense with feudalism, when you went in with your cow, you always got what it was worth. Now, of course, in reality, you didn't, because somebody might steal it, somebody might deceive you, somebody might be a better negotiator than you. But technically, if it's working well, everything gets its value, right? You just work it out in the marketplace. It all just comes out in the wash. Everything always gets its value. And what is value is connected with labour, the amount of labour that goes into something. But everything gets its value. Now, what Marx says about capitalism, he says, well, capitalism, a new commodity appears. And this new commodity never gets its value, right? So before capitalism, you go into the marketplace, you buy and you sell, and you get what it's worth. In capitalism, you do the same thing, but there's one commodity that's different from all of the others. And that commodity never gets what it's worth. Right? And that's the beginning of a structural injustice. So what is this commodity? Well, this commodity is called labour power, right? Labour power is when I go into the market and I don't have very much to sell, but I do have something to sell, and it's my labour. I can sell my labour. That's a product. That's a commodity. And I maybe go to someone and I go, I will sell my labour power to you at $50 a day, right? So my labour power is worth $50 a day. And I'm not coerced into doing that. That is a market thing. I go in, we negotiate, and then this other person says, okay, I'll buy your labour power on a daily basis, $50 a day. But they only do that because my labour power makes $100 a day, right? So I'm paid $50 a day and I make $100 of value every day. And that $50 of extra value goes to the business owner. Now, the business owner has lots of bills and they have to upkeep of the factory, etc., etc. So say $25 of that $50 gets put into the company, and then the other $25 goes to the shareholders, right? So it's an interesting thing. It's like every commodity you buy or sell in the marketplace always gets its value, except for one. And it's not that it doesn't get its value because the system isn't working. It is working. In fact, when the system doesn't work, you do get your value. Maybe you're in a business where it goes bust because it doesn't make any money. It's paying its workers too much. There's no surplus value created, and therefore it collapses. So Marx notices this, and he goes like, okay, so interestingly, injustice in slavery is very obvious. In feudalism, it's less obvious because it's covered over by ideology. And then in capitalism, it's even less obvious because we're all equal, but we're not, right? There's some people who are alienated, and it's not under the law, it's in the very act of labour itself. There is something going on. And without going into too much more detail, what Marx tries to show is this surplus value that's created in the world that goes to the shareholders. This creates all sorts of problems in that eventually there becomes a greater disparity between rich and poor. There's issues between the amount of value that's in the world and the amount of products that are in the world. Creates all of these weird problems. I used to actually live across the road from a second-hand car dealership, and it was a second-hand and brand new. It was Ford Sunshine or what it was called, and or Sunrise, and there was hundreds of cars there. So one thing people think about is that capitalism is a very efficient system, right? But when I would look out at this car lot, I was going like, well, how efficient is it? Because there's all of this, what's called use value. There's all of these cars that could be being used, but they sit there, and I would watch, and there'd maybe be 500 cars, and I would see maybe one being sold in a day. And you go like, eventually some of these cars are going to be scrapped, some of them are going to be reused, or houses. You know, that you live in a place where there's probably more houses in the world than there are homeless people. There is an incredible ability to create, but getting that in the hands of people, there seems to be some sort of issue. So there's all these contradictions begin to arise. Plus alienation. You know, you're working always structurally for less than, you know, it's instead of that money being pulled together and going to everybody who say works for the company, it goes to someone else who you've got no say in, right? So Marx kind of notices this, and his work is about kind of aiming this, and he says, so if capitalism, even if it worked perfectly, right? And capitalism, by the way, always loves more workers. I mean, it's funny that, you know, like a lot of the social progress that has happened in the world has partly been because capitalism is wanting to open up to more workers, right? So after war, of course, there's not as many men around. So to bring more working class women have always worked, but bringing middle class women into the workplace, you know, makes sense after the Second World War, whenever so many of the men had been killed. So these movements are often a way of kind of increasing the scope of capitalism. And capitalism has to keep growing, right? It has to go into new markets, find new ways. So credit was the big thing. It's like, once you've kind of expanded out into every market, how do you create more value? And it's create debt, right? So there's all of these different ways that capitalism continues to try to function, and then of course it hits necessary dips, right? So this is the movement that Marx is exploring. But Todd McGowan brings out, and I'm grateful for him for this because I kind of saw it, but he says it very clearly, is that, you know, even within Marxism there is this right-wing deviation. There is this idea that perhaps there is this future communism in which the contradictions are all resolved, right? And the question is, where does that come from? Where does that deviation, where does the mistake arise? And I've been talking for a while, I'm sorry, but we're getting somewhere. You can watch this in 2 sessions if you want, or 5. Right, the real origin of this dialectic thinking is Hegel, right? It exists before Hegel, and you see it in like even pre-Socratics, people like Heraclitus. But this notion is fully developed by Hegel, who for many people is seen as the most important thinker who has ever lived, right? He is like very, very important. And he is the one who really develops this idea of this ongoing alienation and reconciliation and kind of conflict and deadlock within reality that gives birth to everything, eventually gives birth to self-consciousness, and basically is for Hegel the unfolding of God. We are the universe experiencing itself. We are the universe seeing itself, feeling itself, thinking itself. And Hegel is exploring how that happens over human history and even within the cosmos itself. And he's a conservative thinker, so like dialectics isn't necessarily kind of a left-wing thing. There's a lot of dialecticians who were conservatives. Lacan was pretty conservative, Hegel, Freud, Nietzsche, yeah. But he developed something that a lot of kind of radical thinkers really took to heart, this movement of contradiction. And one of the places that Hegel explains this most clearly and precisely is in his reading of Christianity. That's interesting. So when Hegel looks at Christianity, he sees that this movement of contradiction and eventually to the reconciliation of contradiction happens within the Christian narrative. And what you have then is you have the idea of God, the substance, the absolute, becoming human, right? This first step, which is called incarnation. And incarnation is very similar to traditional atheism, which is the idea that, that a kind of a Spinozanist God is like the universe is the absolute. That's what is, right? The universe is what is. So there's a kind of like you can see this first step of Christianity of God becoming human as in some way connected with kind of more contemporary forms of atheism, which would say, yeah, well, the world is what is. That is what matters. But then for Hegel, there's a second kenosis, right? Kenosis is the self-emptying. So God self-empties into Christ, and then Christ self-empties on the cross. And what that means is there's a sense in which Christ experiences a contradiction within Christ. God experiences a contradiction within God, which is my God, why have you forsaken me, right? And this is the moment when the temple curtain rips open, right? And the distance between God and humanity is closed, right? Symbolically, which is completely connected to this claim. And for Hegel, he says, oh yeah, this is basically in a religious way, a cultic way, he means that in a good sense, this is a way for people to experience the contradiction that is within the absolute, within a religious community. It's kind of existentially, experientially. So the religious believer, they identify with God, trying to escape their fragmentedness, their brokenness, and then God becomes human, so they're confronted with their own humanity, but then God experiences the lack in God. And because we're symbolically identified with God, we realize that the lack that we experience within ourselves, the gap between us and God, is redoubled into God. And that's the epoch of the Holy Ghost, which is basically a democratic community of people gathered in love to look out for one another. There is where God is. So Hegel has this reading of Christianity where he says basically, there you go. It's like, it's not that Christianity is about reconciling a contradiction and getting to heaven where everything will be perfect. There is a type of heaven in Christianity, and heaven is when you're reconciled to the lack of reconciliation, when you are reconciled to contradiction. And this is what he calls absolute knowledge. Absolute knowledge is when you move from the idea that I have a lack of secret. There's a lack of I don't know the answer, right? I am separated from an insight into reality, to the secret of the lack, where you realize that your inability to grasp reality is actually an insight into the very nature of reality itself. The reality itself has a type of superpositioning within it. It has a type of contradiction within it. And this is why for Hegel, he talks about the end of history. It's not like some people think like Hegel thought that he had thought of everything. Right? There's this idea that Hegel basically, in advance, worked out pretty much everything that could be thought. Obviously not everything that could be thought, but like the basic structures of thinking and how it works. But Hegel's not really saying that. He's saying that his insight is that we can't get past knowing that there is contradiction in reality. There's so much more to know, but that is the fundamental insight into reality. And there's no way that we can't overturn that. That was his claim. He goes like, that's the insight that we've come to. And I was talking to somebody recently who was he's a mathematician. I can't remember. He's a Patreon person. I'd look you up. Forgive me for forgetting your name. But he was saying that I sometimes use Gödel as an example of this in mathematics, and he quoted something from Gödel which is very good, which is very useful for me to clarify what I mean, because Gödel was a mathematician who basically there within mathematics, just like in philosophy, there's a desire to kind of map reality, right? So some people think mathematics is the language of reality. You see this with Bertrand Russell and Whitehead in their Principia Mathematica. You see it in Frege as well. Different mathematicians and logicians who are trying to find a way to get an insight into reality through mathematics. And Gödel comes along, and he, through a very complex series of proofs, he makes the claim that you can't do this with mathematics. Either mathematics is consistent, but it doesn't really claim very much, right? Or it tries to claim too much. It tries to give a totalizing view of reality, and then it falls into contradiction. This is exactly what Immanuel Kant was doing in philosophy. He said that when reason tries to give a totalizing view of reality, it falls into what he called antinomies, contradictions. So Kant said we have to stick with understanding being the sciences, what we can empirically show, right? But not trying to break it out into some sort of metaphysics, because we just fall into antinomies. So Gödel's showing the same thing. He says you can't do it. I think his mistake potentially is that what he thought is mathematics can't explain, it can't be the language of reality, because when it tries to be the language of reality, it falls into contradiction. When perhaps that is why it is the language of reality. What he was discovering was not the limitations of mathematics, but actually mathematics reaching its highest insight, right? And I'm not a mathematician at all, so I don't understand much of the mathematics, and I don't know who comes after Gödel and who I should be referring to post that insight. But it's similar to what's the difference between Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr, right? Albert Einstein, who opens up the way for quantum mechanics, but thinks that the contradictions in quantum mechanics show that quantum mechanics isn't the right approach. There's a theory that we need in order to get rid of the contradiction. And then Niels Bohr, who comes in and says, well, no, the contradiction is the answer, right? So this is what Hegel is talking about. This is what he sees within Christianity. And not at a philosophical level, but literally people through the liturgy, through the church, can come to this insight. So this is a very philosophical way of thinking about Christianity, right? But here's the thing that happened after Hegel, right? After Hegel died, there was what's called the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians, or the Young Hegelians, right? The right Hegelians were the conservatives, who really took the more conservative dimensions of Hegel, didn't see him in this radical way, but kind of really interested in his notions of religion and the state and Prussian government, all of that. And then there were the Young Hegelians, and they were the radicals, and they were more leftist leaning, and they saw something in Hegel that was a radical move. And they got rid of the Christianity. They ditched all of that. And the claim of Todd McGowan, I think this is true, this is why I do the work that I do, is that was a mistake. That's why there's a right-wing deviation within the left. It's not the only reason, but it's a good way of understanding it at least. Is because what happened is Feuerbach basically came after Hegel, and he took Hegel's notion of religion and he turned it on its head. And he said, yes, religion is about some sort of contradiction and this dialectic movement. But Feuerbach turned it around and said, what religion is, he says, is human beings at a certain point in our development had to come to know ourselves. And the only way to come to know yourself is to project your essence out and then see it externally, and then you can come to terms with it in yourself. This is called projection. You see it all the time, right? It's very central in psychoanalysis, but often, whenever you see something in another person that you admire or you despise, and then eventually maybe a friend says to you, listen, that's you. What you're disliking in that person is actually, something you don't like about yourself. And you realize that what you're projecting onto the other is something that you haven't seen within yourself, right? So there's this, you put it out there and then you take it back in. And this is very core to the notion of the mirror stage, when a child, in order to come to know itself, mirrors, it basically, the parent says, you're brave, you're strong, you're beautiful. They create an image, you identify with that external image, and then you bring it back into yourself. So Feuerbach basically is looking at this structure with religion. Gods reflect our own essence our own possibilities, our own self, but we put it out into the world. And the problem with that is that we then impoverish ourselves. We do make a move forward, but we need to then realize that all those things that we've put onto the gods are aspects of our own community. And those are things that we can do ourselves. So justice isn't in God, justice is in us. We can be just. So Feuerbach beautifully writes about how, because he says, I'm a friend of the theologians, theology and religion is necessary. It's a necessary step where we become to know ourselves, come to know our potential. But what we must do for religion to fulfill itself is to become material, for communion wine to become wine that people can drink, for baptismal water to become real water, for the bread of communion to become real food for real people, right? So this is Feuerbach's move. But what he does with this is then religion is kind of like done away with. It's just this way of coming to know ourselves. It's a projection of ourselves. Once we realize that, we can take those aspects into ourselves and make a better world. Then Marx comes along, and Marx basically takes Feuerbach's notion of religion. He develops it a little bit. So he says, well, religion isn't a projection of our essence. It's a projection of our epoch, right? It's a projection of the ideals of an age. And it's also a painkiller. It's also a way for us to get rid of real suffering by, imagining a better future in the next life. But Marx kind of takes this on. And the problem is that actually, if the notion of Hegel's Christianity had been taken seriously by the left, we would have a bulwark, a kind of a protection against this right-wing deviation. Because for, say, Hegel, it's like whenever you identify with the cross, you're identifying with the absurd, as in the highest and the lowest coming together, God and the death of God. You're experiencing the contradiction, you're embracing it directly, you're living into it, which brings you into a new mode of being that allows you to be freed from this pursuit of something that will fix everything, and this enemy that has to be removed in order to get everything right. You realize that, right, you're free from this frenetic pursuit, and you're free to embrace contradiction. And in the embrace of contradiction, it weakens its negative power, and therefore you can kind of start to create something else. So in a very concrete, that's what paratheology is. It's trying to set up communities that liturgically enact this reconciliation with contradiction, critiquing opposition or scapegoating, so that we can be freed from the frenetic pursuit that we see in our society of something that is whole and complete, something that will make us whole and complete, something that will fix everything, that keeps us pursuing, and then creating this surplus value. It kind of frees us from this frenetic pursuit. Now, of course, you're still in an economic system that potentially hasn't had that insight, that hasn't moved, but it allows you to find other ways to exist within that, and to potentially, find ways to. It's almost like the future isn't here. It's the idea the kingdom of God is still to come, but is here, right? These are countercultural collectives, subversive collectives that live a type of freedom from this frenetic pursuit of getting rid of the opposition, of having the organic whole. It's an embrace of that inherent, my God, why have you forsaken me? And working with that, right, to kind of actually lead a more healthy kind of life. So, therefore, pyrotheology has a political dimension, which is to try to bring back the importance of contradiction, and to try to show that, again, the battle is not against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers. In other words, we should never be attacking bad actors. Bad actors are bad actors, and we should try and get rid of them when we can, and put them to court, and use the legal system, and improve the legal system, and do all of that. But at the most concrete, the issue is we have systems that have contradiction within them, but refuse to acknowledge that contradiction, that repress it, that deny it, that disavow it, that turn the contradiction into opposition and then create enemies that we have to just get rid of in order to have some sort of purity. And that is a type of fantasy that we can only break free from when we acknowledge the contradiction. When you acknowledge the contradiction, you don't need the scapegoat. You don't need the opposition. As I say, you can still have enemies, but you don't love your enemies like a hypochondriac loves their cancer. You can have enemies, you go like, that is not a good position and we need to do something about it. But when you are caught up in the fantasy of the organic whole and the scapegoat as the one who is threatening that, then you need the scapegoat. You're kind of libidinally invested in the enemy, because when you get rid of the enemy, you will be confronted with the inherent necessary conflicts and antagonisms within the structure you currently persist in. So to finish off, I'll just say this is like the question then for politics today is whether we can create a productive politics of contradiction, of whether that, because some people might say, well, that's an acceptance of the way things are, but whether actually by exposing the necessary contradictions and alienation that's within society and not always putting it on some sort of scapegoat, some sort of opposition, whether that is the next stage in history. The next stage is absolute knowledge in the words of Hegel, or salvation in the words of Christianity. Right? It's somehow communities that are broken free from this frenetic desire for the wholeness and completeness, and then the violence against the enemy who threatens that wholeness and completeness, this acceptance of some sort of metaphysical lack that then means we can organize society in a healthier way around that lack. And okay, very concretely, that might mean like democracy within the workplace, right? That's just one example of how it might look. Is you then go, if you have it's a cooperative, right? You have a company that creates something, and there are lots of cooperatives out there. You have a cooperative, and you vote for the chairperson, and they're just like you vote for a politician, and their job is to work out what happens with the surplus value, how that's distributed among the people who work there. You work the company longer, you get more of it. You work less time, you get less of it, etc., etc. But somehow that is shared. There's less alienation, and it's a way of reconciling, doing something with the contradiction. So there are ways of doing it. I don't want to say too much about what it looks like, but I think there are ways of actually thinking about society in a deeper way, and that's politics. Okay, let's look. Okay, there's some questions and thoughts. Deep Dive Spirituality says, thanks for offering this level of teaching. Thank you. I don't know whether you mean this level as in high level or low level or medium level, but thank you. I appreciate it. But then you retracted some messages. Maybe you said something nasty to me after that. I don't know. Let's see. Here we go. How can we model, Dave Deep Dive, how can we model speech that does not use opposition but accepts lovingly the contradictory perspective? What does this look like in a political theological conversation today? Great. So how can we model speech that does not use opposition but accepts the contradiction perspective? What's it look like today? Yeah, I mean, the way you see the opposition talk is always scapegoating. Like any time you start seeing scapegoating, where some other is not just a political enemy, like someone to have conflict with, someone to disagree with, someone to like actually dislike, not all of that, right? But someone to be done away with in order to bring peace and wholeness back to the collective, then that always oppositional thinking is hidden within that. And here's the thing, right? I know a lot of this is very abstract, but actually René Girard has a great theory of Christianity that sees, and I think any theologian worth their salt sees the importance of this, is that Christianity is fundamentally against scapegoating. Like that's the kind of the fundamental message right through Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition is a critique of this type of oppositional thinking. So what does contradictory thinking look like? In general, I guess it is, but I mean, it's openness to conflict. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. Now, I want to be like, this is not about arguing with kind of idiots, right? People who are bad actors and all of that, right? But it does mean engaging with honest opposition, intelligent opposition, being able to sit in a room. And I mean, for me, Northern Ireland is a great example. In 1998, the peace process began, and there was a document called the Good Friday Agreement that was signed on Good Friday, which is really interesting to me. It just happens to be, but the fact that I'm connected with Christianity makes it nice. And basically, what happened in Northern Ireland is the politicians on all sides, the British and the Irish and Northern Irish politicians, also all the major paramilitary groups, all decided to sit down together and to work out a way forward and a power sharing and all of that. And what it was what was initially oppositional thinking, where the enemy that had to be destroyed, eventually through all of the suffering, all of the violence, all of the political wrangling, sat down and said, we're gonna fight this through and see what happens, see if we can create a way to move forward. And they created the Good Friday Accord. And it is an expression of what contradiction looks like in politics. Is these people didn't know what was going to come out of it. Just like I said about Marx, the Marxists will say, you can't know what the next epoch is going to be because you'll just end up recreating the current epoch, but in a kind of like cleaner way, right? So it's like your dreams are always idealized reflections of your present values, right? And the point is not to fulfill your dreams, but to dream new dreams, right? That's this idea, is that whenever you dream of like being rich, well, that's just kind of the ideal within the current frame of desire. A new form of being will create a new form of desire, and you can't really know what the dream will be, but you enter into a room with the idea that a new dream can arise. And that's what I think happened in Northern Ireland. Is like they knew what they wanted to happen, right? But they didn't know what would be created in this very difficult space. And what happened was novelty. And that's very key for me. Novelty is when you see contradiction at work, because opposition doesn't generate novelty. Contradiction is when people come in and they go that we don't know what this fight and this conflict will lead to, but we're willing to have it. And when you do that, novelty arises, which simply means solutions can be found. And I like the idea of novelty more than progress. Not so much progress, but it's novelty. New ideas arise. So that's kind of what I think it looks like. Oh yeah, and then how does one shift an oppositional confrontation into a fair conversation about contradiction? Any ideas? Okay, I'll give you a really twee example of this. Is just think about it like in relation to fighting with someone you love, right? That gets oppositional very, very quickly. You see something in the news and you have one opinion and your partner has another, and within 5 minutes you're arguing like world experts and you're like this and you're just bashing heads, right? And you get so annoyed. It's like the other if only the other person could see the right answer, right? So we get into this. If one person stops for a moment, and the right moment has to be the right moment, says, to be honest with you, I don't know. I mean, I think this, but I could be wrong. Maybe you're right. It allows for the other person, if it's said at the right moment in the right way, to then also go, yeah, maybe I don't know either, right? And then you enter into that really interesting and productive conversation. And it's the act of weakness. I in my first book, I think I called it powerless discourse. So there's power discourse, which is oppositional, but powerless discourse is kind of this weird, interesting thing where you go, you know what, maybe not, maybe I'm wrong. And it doesn't always work, of course, but if you do that in the right time or moment, it really lowers people's defenses and you can have a real conversation. That's why I don't like a lot of the stuff on YouTube where everyone's attacking everyone, it just ratchets up people's defense mechanisms. Even if you think the person's right, you're going to be argumentative. Like if I see a friend and they're being nasty to their sister and I say, you're an asshole to your sister, they're likely to go, no, I'm not. But if I sit down with them, buy them a drink and say, man, you seem really stressed out, and you were pretty tough on your sister, then it allows the person to go, oh, yeah, I know, I've been really stressed at work, and yeah, I totally took it out on her, right? So that's the art. That's the art of conversation, both individually and also societally. How do we create those types of spaces societally? The way I tried to do it within evangelicalism many years ago was with the Evangelism Project, which conservatives loved. They really did, genuinely. Not like, so it was, I think you'll probably know, but we would go out to be evangelized by other communities. And the evangelism was when we said to, say, the Islamic Society, not what do you believe, right? We learnt about what they believed, but it was when we said, what do we look like to you? And what does the Christian community look like to you? And then you saw yourself through their eyes, and that's when the evangelism happened. You were being evangelized by the other. And a lot of young conservatives loved this idea, because the young conservatives love to be challenged in religion. You know, they want to do the right thing. So what that did was try to create a place that, instead of being oppositional, it was like real openness to the other, to learn. And I think it was productive on all sides. So that's kind of one example of me trying to create that space within an evangelical framework. Now I'm looking at doing it in a political framework. So watch this space. Jill just said, thank you, Pete, no questions, just need to let it filter in my head. Thank you, Jill, appreciate you watching. Thanks very much. I'm doing a little C.S. Lewis talk tomorrow, and then I'm doing C.S. Lewis's talk will be my next pyroseminar, and that will be live in Belfast. So if you live in Belfast, drop me an email and come along and say hi in person. Take care. Bye-bye.